all record to remind you, I think, as you will probably tell by the size of this room. And I'm going to ask you to please stay in your seats at the end because we will have some closing remarks by Jim O'Neill, the chairman of Chatham House, after the conversation. And after Jim has left with Secretary Mnuchin and Joel Hellman, we will then all be having a reception together. So we can get into the reception. Please stay in your seats at the end until the Secretary has at least left the room. I'm now going to welcome everyone up, but I do want to introduce Joel as well, because Joel's become a great partner of Chatham House in this last few months as we've been planning this meeting with the Secretary's office. Took up the position of Dean of Georgetown School of Foreign Service 5 years ago, 15 years before that at the World Bank, including as the chief institutional economist, and a very distinguished career at Harvard, Columbia, and other academic institutions before that. So Joel, I'm going to let you run the conversation. Jim will have some remarks afterwards, but welcome both of you to Chatham House.
Thank you, Robin, for that introduction. And congratulations to Chatham House on its centenary. We're thrilled to be here and to share in part of that celebration. And thank you, Secretary Mnuchin, for agreeing to come and join us and have a conversation. As Robin mentioned, because we are thinking in long shifts, big terms, 100 years of both of our institutions, and we started at a period in 1919 after the devastation of World War I, when the leaders of the world were gathering together to really rethink the fundamental principles of how the global order should be restructured to preserve peace and build prosperity. I want to start perhaps at that large level, and then we get to some more specific current issues. But to ask you what you see at your vantage point now here in 2020, the 2 or 3 really major trends that you think are reshaping the world order to some extent as they were thinking in 1919 about the trends shaping the world order then.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here, and congratulations to both of you on your significant anniversaries. I think there are some very significant issues, but I also think there are some basic issues that are going to impact the world. And I think thinking over 100 years is sometimes awfully hard, so I'll try for more 10 to 20 years. And the reason why I say I think thinking for 100 years is the world has changed so much in ways that we couldn't have predicted. And as a general matter, I would say technology advances much quicker than we think about. So a lot of the things that we may think are problems today, I think technology will advance those issues. So I would say that the first thing I would say is technology. I think it has been very transformational over the 100 years in every single aspect of our economy, our world order. I think some specific issues as it relates to technology. Obviously, it creates issues in certain industries have been created that don't exist. It transforms other energies. So I think education and making sure as it impacts jobs that people have the necessary skills. I would also say privacy issues are something. As we are more and more connected, both privacy and encryption and cyber issues are very important, since I think we're going to be, whether it's a 5G world or other things, I mean, we're going to be in the world where almost everything is connected. So I would say technology is an important issue. The second thing I would say is having access to stable global energy markets. I think if you look at the 70s, the world was very dependent upon oil out of the Middle East. It had significant geopolitical issues. I think if you look at today, and particularly the advance over the last 10 or 20 years, you have the United States now being energy independent and an exporter of energy. That's not something we would have anticipated 25 years ago. You have an abundance of natural gas around the world. I think natural gas particularly is very efficient and is more environmentally friendly than perhaps other carbon. But the abundance of energy creates great economic opportunities. I would also just comment, although there's an abundance of energy, there's a significant number of people in the world that don't have access to electricity. So as much as the environmental issues, I think we also have to get more people who have advantage of these things. And then the last thing I would just comment on, economic growth and job creation has been very important, continues to be very important. I think that the next generation wants to feel that they have the same or better opportunities. And it is important for both on an individual country basis and on a global basis that we are creating economic growth, because that's what creates jobs and that's what creates opportunities. And whether you look at certain areas, China, which is, although it's the second largest economy in the world, it has a huge issue. 1,350,000,000 people. It still has a huge need for job creation, and whether it's China, India, or other parts of the world. And I think in the United States, one of the things we've been very focused on, even though we have now the lowest unemployment rates in the world, economic growth and making sure that we can create economic opportunities is our priority.
You mentioned China in the midst of this, and China is going to be an important player in all three of the trends that you mentioned, on the technology side, on the privacy and security issues that are associated with that, on the energy side as an energy consumer and a producer, and certainly in growth and job creation, given their role as a creditor globally and as a major and increasingly growing economy. How do you see your immediate tasks in your growing relationship with China post the trade deal, first phase of the trade deal, to deal with the fact that China is going to be a major player in all of these long-term shifts?
Well, I think, as you know, I've spent an awful lot of time over the last 3 years on the China economic relationship. We couldn't be more pleased that we were able to sign what we call a phase 1 trade agreement. I think it is enormously significant, both to the U.S. and also globally. As the two largest economies, this is, one, a very important economic relationship, but two, more importantly, I think opening up China to the U.S. and Europe and others, competing on a fair basis, is very important. China has a large growing middle class, over 300 million people. That is a great opportunity for U.S., European, and other countries and workers. And our focus has always been on, from day one, the president's objective has been, and this was the first time we had our summit at Mar-a-Lago with President Trump and President Xi. The president was very clear that he wanted balanced trade. And the reason we didn't have balanced trade, our market had been very open to them for investments in trade. Their market had been very closed. So our focus of phase 1 is fair and reciprocal trade. We have very significant commitments in technology for the first time, around forced technology transfer issues, patent protection, agriculture, structural issues, financial services, currency protection, and for the first time, an enforcement provision in a trade agreement. So I think that that will be a major factor helping economic growth this year and going forward.
Now, you talked about some of the opportunities, and on the challenges on the China relationship side, one of the issues that you raised in talking of the big picture is on the technology front and what that means for privacy and security. In the negotiations in phase 1 and what you might think of as a potential phase 2, how are you trying to deal with potential risks associated with how technology is essentially sort of changing the global order, and what that might mean for China, a very different political system with very different interests, using technology in a way that we're uncomfortable with? And how do you see that playing out in your China negotiations?
Sure. Well, let me first say again, technology has had an enormous impact in the last 100 years and has changed the world in ways we never fully could have anticipated. So although I think it's an issue going forward, I want to put this in perspective. We've been dealing with these issues in the post-war environment. And I think, like any other relationship, there can be areas where we cooperate, and there can be areas where we compete, and there can be areas where we agree, and there can be areas where we don't agree. So I think that's managing a relationship. And as you've said, it's a different political system. we like our political system, they have their political system, but it's important as the two largest economies to be able to work together.
Now, you're talking about how we work together. You've had phase one. In Davos, you've talked a lot about the successes of phase one and the USMCA. I wonder, having now achieved those milestones, what have you learned from that first phase of engagement on trade, on both of those trade deals? Any kind of lessons that you've taken from that as you think about the next stages of your trade negotiations with them and with others?
Well, I would comment on in any negotiation, there are issues that you just have to be prepared for. And I think one of the things we did was we reached out to a lot of people, both business and in other areas, to make sure that we had the proper input. Some of these issues, as it relates to in China, the U.S. has been dealing with for the last 10 years. I think not everybody loves the president's tariffs, but there's no question the tariffs are a very important factor in changing behavior, because quite frankly, whether it was China or other trade relationships that were advantageous to the other party, people just don't like to change. So I think that the president was very clear from day one that he wanted to have open and fair and reciprocal trade, and that was really the basis of our negotiations.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned here, and I also heard in Davos talking about the role that tariffs played and the threat of tariffs in pushing the negotiations forward, getting to the table, getting concessions on some very, very difficult areas. I wonder how you think about the second and third order effects of the use of tariffs. The first order effects are getting the deal and getting some positive movement on the deal. Are there other effects, though, in terms of the longer-term relationship that you have with China or your other trading partners of using tariffs in that way to sort of get the short-term deal? How does it impact the long-term relationship as you might see it?
Well, look, I think that, again, when you look at economic issues or other issues, I think part of the time is politicians look too much to the short term. And perhaps that's a little bit of because our system has elections. But I think one of the things that the president was very clear on was he campaigned on certain issues. He was prepared to deliver those issues, and he was prepared to deliver them because these are in the long-term best interests of the United States. And I think there are certain short-term economic issues, but the president was very clear in direction of these are long-term issues. These have been not dealt with over years, and he was prepared to deal with them.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you think about trade and your oversight of America's role in a trading system overall, right? We know that there's been efforts on bilateral trade deals, and the president has made that very clear that that's a priority of his to correct some of these bilateral deals that he didn't think were in the interest of the United States, and he's made some progress in that area. I wonder if you might give us a sense of what you think the bigger vision on trade is beyond the bilateral deals. What is the kind of trade regime that you think this administration envisions going forward that sits on top of the bilateral deals, the role of the WTO, and how you see that evolving, or some other way in which these bilateral deals will sort of essentially add up to a broader trading regime for globally?
Well, again, I think the reason why the president has instructed us to focus on bilateral deals is just because these agreements are hard enough to negotiate bilaterally that trying to get everybody to the table at the same time, and this is true in any negotiation, you tend to go to the lowest denominator to get an agreement. But let me just say that if you look at USMCA, which is our largest trading bloc, so that was with Mexico and Canada. You look at China, you look at now we're going to be negotiating a free trade agreement with the UK. You look at, we're very focused now on trade negotiations with the EU. Those agreements are the majority of our trade. I would also just comment, we've added on Japan and Korea. I don't want to leave them out. So I think the president's view is if we can get these major trade agreements done, we can then always roll up the other 10 or 20% of trade into similar types of agreements. So it's really as much of a strategy issue of how to get it done than a philosophical issue.
And from your vantage point, is there a role for the World Trade Organization to play in this trading regime, and how are you thinking about that going forward? As many of the audience members may know, I mean, the United States has been blocking some appointments to the WTO appellate body that might impact the WTO's ability to play that oversight role on the appellate side. What's the strategy and thinking about the role of the WTO, and where do you see that going?
Well, let me just comment on, there's been a lot of important global institutions that have been set up post-war. The WTO is one of them. I know the World Bank, where you have a lot of history, and the IMF, I think, are also very, very important institutions. So let me just comment. I think there is absolutely a role for these global institutions. Having said that, in the case of the WTO, some of these institutions, when they operate on a consensus basis, are very difficult to change. And you may have seen in Davos, we had a bilat with the head of the WTO, and then he participated in the president's press conference, and he was pitching to the president, we need WTO reform. So I think there is absolutely a role, but I think, we have to look at a bunch of these institutions, and we should continuously look at how we can bring them into the new modern economy and have them perform appropriately for everybody.
And what are the kind of key areas we'd like to see change in the current sort of structure? Either it's in the WTO or the other international or global institutions. Are there kinds of key areas that you're trying to push in the next stage of engagement with those institutions as you think about what a new WTO look like, or maybe a new other global institutional structure? What are you trying to get in the next stage?
I don't necessarily see the role for a new institutional structure, but I do think, on the WTO specifically, there are very specific things. So I don't want to bore the whole group here, but I think the answer is, it needs to, the rules and regulations need to be modernized to have them work.
Okay. Well, you did mention the U.S.-UK trade relationship. Obviously, this is going to be an important issue here. Brexit, of course, only days away. I mean, what's on your immediate agenda for discussion with the Chancellor here in terms of where you see the U.S.-UK trade relationship going?
Well, I had the opportunity to see the Chancellor in Davos, and I also had breakfast with him this morning at number 11, so I was pleased to see him as long as I was here. And the UK is our most important relationship. It's a very strategic relationship. I give this government a lot of credit for they campaigned on getting this done. They're getting it done. We've said that our goal, their goal is we're going to try to get both of these trade agreements done this year. And I think from the U.S. standpoint, we are prepared to dedicate a lot of resources. I think the UK and US have very similar economies with a big focus on services. And I think this will be a very important relationship. And this is going back to the president during the campaign. He said, if post-Brexit, they said, they'll be at the top of the list in terms of negotiating.
Mm-hmm. Is the timing of an agreement with the United States versus an agreement with Europe an important issue for you, or it was on the top of the agenda for the president? Is the timing of this trade relationship something important, and do you have a sense of what that timing might be, given the fact that obviously there's also going to be the relationship and renegotiation of the relationship with Europe?
I think the timing is important, and we're focused on trying to get this done this year because we think it's important to both of us. And there'll be certain issues that perhaps they need to resolve with the EU before they finalize our agreement. But I think a lot of the issues can be dealt with simultaneously. And again, we look forward to continuing a great trade relationship. And if anything, I think there will be significantly more trade between the US and the UK.
I'd like to ask you about a couple of the potential sort of stumbling blocks and get a sense of how you're thinking about them. And some of these came up in your conversations in Davos as well. I know one of the issues that has been a potential issue that you're going to have to confront is on the digital tax. How do you see that relationship both with the UK and with Europe going, given the concerns that you have already expressed on that tax?
Sure. So let me just say there's a disproportionate amount of interest in this topic. But, you know, and even people talk about the digital service tax, there's actually a process going on at the OECD to deal with international tax issues. And I think, as you know, international tax issues are very, very important because if we have companies that have global operations, we have different taxing authorities. For both U.S. and other companies to be able to succeed, you have to have international tax agreements that work together so that you have understanding as to both tax certainty and tax allocation. And one of the things we hear from all of our large companies is that there are more and more global tax issues where different countries are trying to fight for revenue allocation. So I just want to put this in perspective. This is one of complex global tax issues that we're talking about. In the OECD process, there's what we refer to as Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Pillar 2, I think there's pretty much a consensus on for a global minimum tax. This is something we instituted in the US as part of tax reform. We call it the GILTI tax. And the idea is that there shouldn't be a chase to the bottom on taxes. And you know, there shouldn't be tax havens that don't charge any tax or charge minimal tax. So I think that in terms of revenues is a much, much more important issue to all of us. And that I think we're pretty close. On what we call Pillar 1, there are complicated issues. The US feels very strongly that any tax that is designed specifically on digital companies is a discriminatory tax and is not appropriate and has violations to our tax treaties and other issues. So we're working through that, and I think we have a good outcome of trying to give some room now in 2020 to continue these discussions.
Another issue that's come up is on the issue of 5G and 5G technology. Again, kind of raising a technology issue and the role of Huawei in providing services on 5G. Again, how do you see that playing out as the U.S.-UK trade and negotiations and discussions go on?
Well, we're having discussions with the UK. We're having conversations with many of our allies. If you look at the role of technology, it is critical that we have infrastructure that's protected, and we have important relationships. I mean, I think what's clear is for the role of government, for the role of national security issues, for the role of defense, we want to make sure our infrastructures are protected. And I think on a broader basis, as I said earlier, as more and more things are connected to the network and to the grid, these national security issues go beyond the traditional aspects and go into various different aspects. So I think the real issue for us is making sure that the networks and infrastructure are properly protected.
I also want to ask you, and again, another potential, issue that will obviously be part of the agenda discussion is the UK's position on opening up economic relations, keeping relationships open with Iran and the JCPOA. Again, how do you see that playing out in the discussions?
Well, I'm glad you asked me that question, and this is one of the comments that I made in Davos. You know, there are important issues going on around the world. I think one of the most important issues that is going to affect the next 10, 20, 30, 50 years is making sure that we have a stable Middle East. And the president has been very clear that we can never have a world where Iran has a nuclear weapon. And that we share common objectives with all of our allies. I think we have an absolute agreement on that. I think the issue of the JCPOA, the president was very clear. The problem with the agreement is that it gave them a lot of money, and we didn't get the protections in return. Matter of fact, at the end of the agreement, it was going to enable Iran to have nuclear weapons. And the agreement also didn't address ballistic missiles, which, as I'm sure you've recently seen, can be quite problematic. So this is a very important issue for us, for the UK, for our European allies, and for everyone around the world. So the issue of sanctions and how we apply, we may have had a different view on the effectiveness of the JCPOA, but I think there's no issue between us and all of our allies that Iran can't have nuclear weapons. And I think particularly given the recent events, people understand our position and we are unified. And I think you know that the UK and the Europeans have activated the mechanism now that Iran is in violation of the JCPOA. We expect that that's going to go through a process and the UN sanctions will snap back in. And we have a common view. But security issues in the Middle East are critical to all of us.
And these issues, any of these issues, the taxation, the privacy and security issues associated with 5G, these issues they're associated with that, are these like red line issues in the negotiations that are that essentially, if we do not reach a positive agreement that works for the president, obviously in his interest, that this is going to make it very difficult to find a way forward on the U.S.-UK relationship? How do you kind of see these issues playing themselves out in the negotiations as we go forward?
I'm quite optimistic. I think that the Prime Minister and the President have a very good relationship. I think, again, there can be areas where we agree 100% on. There could be areas where we have issues on. I think the trade agreement is an area where, again, we're both highly motivated. And I would just say on the Iran issue, I think we have a common view now of where we are. And again, I think the president has been very clear. All we want is an agreement that makes clear they never have nuclear weapons and addresses regional security issues such as ballistic missiles and terrorist activities.
Now, how do you see the U.S.-Europe relationship evolving on trade in particular as you move ahead simultaneously on negotiations? And again, from your vantage point, the timing on the Europe side, we talked a little bit about from Britain's standpoint. From the U.S. side, handling both of these sort of simultaneously, how do you see those two things evolving and how affecting each other, if they do affect each other?
Well, I think, as you know, the president has a broad economic agenda. Trade has been one of the three pillars. During the campaign, we developed the economic policy of tax cuts, regulatory relief, and trade. There's no question, you know, just coming back from Davos, there's no question that the U.S. economy is the bright spot of the world. The economic growth that we have is a result of the president's economic agenda, and we'll continue this economic agenda. So, you know, we got a lot to do, and we'll focus on all of it at once. So the president has made clear now that we got China done, the UK and Europe are our priority. But I would just also comment, Ambassador Lighthizer in the midst of negotiating some changes to the agreement with India. So we got a lot of these agreements going on at the same time.
And what do you think, on the European side at least, what are going to be the key sticking points in that discussion? What are the kinds of things that you're hoping to kind of move forward in terms of some of the difficult issues that you may be facing in the discussions with Europe?
We have 150 billion trade balance with the EU on goods. We do have a trade surplus on services, but we are focused on narrowing that trade gap. And again, when we talk about the EU, one of the challenges is some of these issues are really only a couple of countries. But I think, as you know, because of the EU, we can't negotiate these things on a bilateral basis. So one of the challenges of dealing with the EU, even within the EU, they have different views.
So how optimistic are you, given those differences?
Highly optimistic. Highly optimistic.
What's the cause of your optimism?
I think we've shown a great success of getting things done and plowing through these issues.
Okay. Well, before we're going to go to questions in just a few minutes, I want you to talk a little bit about. I know that you've still got some time before the elections, but I wonder if thinking beyond the elections, if there is a sort of second term and you decide to sort of stay in the administration in a second term, what do you see as the sort of unfinished agenda beyond the elections that you as Treasury Secretary would be focusing on? What are the key points of business that you think a second term will be focused on?
Well, I would say I do expect there will be a second term, and I've already publicly said that I would stay on with the president. I think infrastructure is a big priority for the president. This is one of the areas we talked about during the campaign. We got a lot of things done on a bipartisan basis. This is one of the areas that we have not been able to focus on, and that will be a big focus of the second term.
Mm-hmm. Infrastructure. What do you think are the key threats that perhaps you see to global growth going forward that might also kind of motivate your thinking about what's the next term? As opposed to the immediate threats, you were talking something about the long-term issues of growth. What do you see as the key threats to continued global growth that you want to be working on?
Well, again, I think when you talk about global growth and people have these global growth statistics, I mean, it's really, what are we going to do to have continued growth? And I think the president's economic policies will continue through 2020 and 2021. I think if you look at, we've had very good increase in wages, we've had very low inflation. Our GDP numbers have been slightly lower than they should be, somewhat as a result of the issues with Boeing, which is our largest exporter, and the fact that we had the GM strike. But I think what's good for us is not only U.S. growth, but growth in other areas of the world, because that creates expanding markets for all of us. And I think in the case of Europe, there have been certain policy issues. I would suggest that Europe develop some more pro-growth economic policies. This just can't be monetary. And I would comment of, the world of negative interest rates. We haven't seen negative interest rates like this in this size and scale. And look, I think it's hard to have healthy banks with negative interest rates, and I think it's hard to have healthy economies without healthy banks.
Mm-hmm. And what are you thinking about the policy towards the dollar? I mean, as you think about kind of the future, you talked about monetary policy. As Treasury Secretary, and again, thinking about a long-term perspective, what's your approach to thinking about the dollar?
Well, let me just say, one of the things I've clearly learned as Treasury Secretary, I'm very careful about my comments on the dollar, because 2 years ago in Davos, I sneezed and I said something that I thought was completely calm, and all of a sudden the markets went crazy. So let me be clear, I support a stable dollar, but I'm not going to make more comments on that. But what I will make a comment on is the dollar is the reserve currency of the world. With that creates certain advantages, and with that comes certain responsibilities. So one of the things I do spend a lot of my time on, I probably spend half my time on national security, because we manage the government sanctions programs, and the sanctions programs are very effective because the dollar is the reserve currency. And one of the things we balance is, our European friends and allies may not always like what we're doing on sanctions, but I do seriously think about, we have a responsibility to use sanctions for important national security issues, but we need to think about the long-term impact on the global currency.
Okay. Well, I want to ask you just a final question before I open it up. And you just came back from Davos. It's often kind of termed as the playground of the global elite. You're talking about two institutions here that were forged in 1919, 1920, when the thinking at the time really was about how to imagine a new multilateralism. and a new way of global engagement in the aftermath of the war. Since then, 100 years later, the term globalism has taken a connotation. I wonder how you kind of define globalism and globalists, and what you see as the kind of the issue. Is there a problem with globalist thinking, and how should we be thinking about multilateralism outside that context?
Well, let me just say, because I came back from Davos, and people think of Davos as this globalist entity. In preparation for today, I didn't do a lot of prep, but the one thing I did do is I looked up the definition of globalism. Because, and what it says is the operation or planning of economic and foreign policy on a global basis. That's globalism. Operation or planning on a global basis. And I think the president's right in what the president has said many times. The president said, he represents the American public, and his job is to do what's good for America. And my job as Treasury Secretary is to focus on what's good for America. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that things that we do aren't good for other people. So, I'm going to take a shot at saying I think this globalism brand, okay, I think that perhaps historically in the last 10 or 20 years, perhaps countries weren't thinking enough about their own issues as they were thinking about these issues. And one of the things that the president has been very focused on is, for the past 10 years, wages in the U.S. for the middle class didn't go up. Our first objective was creating economic growth and creating economic opportunities. But I think the answer is that we can have both, because I think we can do things that are good for us, which are good for global growth. So, I think I do think we have to redefine some of these brands. Another issue, people talk about capitalism. I think, as you know, we have an election where we have certain people who like capitalism and certain people like socialism. I think some of these issues we need to perhaps redefine. I think kind of economic freedom versus economic controls and planning. And I think one of the things we've seen in the U.S. is when you let private business and you let the economy follow through with certain proper incentives, you get the right outcome.
Well, I mean, one of the things that's on our minds because of our centennial celebrations is when you think about America in 1919 or 1920, it had become the world's largest creditor nation after the war. Before the war, was the world's largest debtor nation. A lot of the story of 1919 and 1920 was America's role in the world, not only as a strong military power and a strong economic power, but as an important player in multilateral engagement, as a convener of multilateral engagement. And however we define the role of globalism and the term of globalism, this notion of America's role in sort of essentially contributing to a multilateral sort of framework of cooperation beyond America's bilateral engagements, is still something that I haven't heard a lot from you or from the administration about how you think about America's role in that multilateral framework. So I'm just as a last thought, where do you see America as a convener of multilateralism? Or is this not just part of the agenda as you see it?
No, I think it's very important. And let me just give you an example of NATO, where the president has been very clear and I think has shown great leadership, where we've invested a lot of money in the last 3 years in our military. The president has said there was a commitment of 2% to NATO. Why are countries not honoring that commitment? So I think that there's very much a role for many of these institutions, but everybody has to be committed. And then the last thing I will just say is, you're commenting 100 years ago. Let's not forget there was this little thing called World War II. Okay, I'm quite honored. I'm going tomorrow to Poland. I'm representing the president and leading a delegation to Auschwitz for the 75th anniversary of when Auschwitz was freed. Let's not forget that 75 years ago, we saw great challenges to the world order. And I think whether it's anti-Semitism or other issues, these issues are still very relevant today. So I think we all have a lot of work to do.
Thank you. Well, look, I'm going to open it up to questions. If you could please raise your hands and keep it in the form of a question, please. I'd appreciate it. I'm going to start with the gentleman in the second row, second in. Yes, you? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, hi, Jonathan Paris, a London-based Middle East expert. My claim to fame, Dean Hellman, is that I started at the Council on Foreign Relations at the same year that Charlie Kupchan started 25 years ago. On sanctions, most people have been rather impressed with your ability to use economic sanctions to pressure Iran. It was much more effective than during the Obama era and even during the Clinton era when there were similar sanctions. How do you explain it? And particularly internally, how do you handle the deep bench when you lose somebody like Segal, who is managing the sanctions process, and yet you're able to continue to enact? Just this week, I think you put sanctions on a Dubai, Shanghai, and Hong Kong company. What's the magic? What's the secret to success in the Treasury Department in this new kind of economic coercion?
Well, thank you. And first, let me comment, for those of you who don't know, Segal was my undersecretary for this area, terrorist financing and intelligence, and she did a terrific job and has been a terrific part of our team. When I came into the government, there are certain things that I had a lot of experience in. I had experience in domestic and international finance. As I've said, there are certain things I didn't have a lot of experience in. National security and sanctions were not an area of my expertise. When I got there, we have a terrific team at Treasury of people who have been there for very long periods of time, and I immersed myself in studying these issues. I kind of refer to it as I got a PhD in my first 120 days. So, I think when I've said, as Treasury Secretary, I spend 50% of my time on national security, people are normally surprised when they hear that, and I'm probably the first Treasury Secretary that's done that. I think historically, it's probably been 10 or 20% of the job. And the reason, and I understood this very quickly, as did the president wanted to have an integrated national security approach. So I meet regularly, and we look at the national security team, Secretary of State Pompeo, myself, Esper, the intelligence community, Robert O'Brien. We have an integrated approach, and the economic side of it is as important as the military side of it. And I think the president has been very clear that he'd prefer not to use the military approach in many of these cases. He wanted to, take back military assets. But let me just say, for people who question our strategy, the sanctions have been very important. Again, this is not about the Iranian people. We've literally cut off tens and tens of billions of dollars that would have gone to expand terrorist activities. And we hope that Iran realizes they should come back into the world order. There is a great economic future for the people of Iran if they're willing to behave responsibly in the world. And again, when you talk about world order and global issues, nuclear issues are a global issue.
Yes. This lady in front.
Thank you very much. My name's Isabel Hilton. I'm a member at Chatham House. You've referenced the USMCA several times. Article 3210 of USMCA attracted some attention when the deal was signed. That's the one that says if any party enters into a free trade agreement with a non-market economy country, then the other parties are at liberty to terminate the agreement with 6 months' notice. And the administration indicated very strongly that it would seek to replicate this article in any future trade agreement. Is that still the administration's position, and what does that mean for discussions with the United Kingdom, which also seeks to have a strong trading relationship with China, a notable non-market country?
Well, first, let me just comment. I'm very impressed. You've obviously read the agreement, and I'm glad you've picked up an important aspect. It's one of the many important aspects. But again, you know, USMCA really brought, we think, the trading relationship into the modern era. That's one of the issues. There's a lot of them. I'm not going to comment on the specific of that as it relates to, but yes, we've broadly said we'd like to use that. And there's plenty of other things in that agreement we'd like to use as a model. But thank you for acknowledging the importance of that.
Okay. There's a question in the back. The lady in the back.
Yes, hi. Hi, thank you, Secretary, for your comments this morning. I'm Rebecca Martin, a graduate of the German and European Studies program here at SFS, and I'm happy that you can be here to celebrate our centennial. Today, there's been a lot of emphasis on economic growth and stability as driving forces of the U.S. economic agenda. How do we balance this with rising environmental concerns and recognizing that we have severe natural disasters, both at home in the United States? I'm thinking of the California forest fires recently, and currently in Australia and the Commonwealth, and most of the continent, or large portions of the continent, being on fire. So how do we balance that as also a form of a security threat and recognizing that as the ultimate threat to our economic stability? Thank you.
Great, thank you. So let me just say, as Treasury Secretary, I do cover kind of very diverse areas in the government, and one of the things I like a lot about the job is it spans a lot of areas. But let me just say, I am not an environmental expert. So I want to be clear, I'm going to make some comments on this, but some of you may have noticed I made a comment at a press conference in Davos, which was intended to be said somewhat in jest, okay? And I commented in the press conference this was a joke, but seems to have caught a lot of attention. So let me just make two comments. What I've said in Davos, and this I absolutely believe, and there was a lot of focus in Davos on environmental issues, and I think that's fine, okay? But the comment that I made in Davos is there are a lot of important issues that that impact the world and the economy, and I just hope that we balance these other issues and we talk about these other issues as much as we talk about the environment. So whether, as I said, it's issues with Iran in the Middle East, or it's issues, obviously a major issue that we're focusing on right now is global health issues. You know, we appreciate how China is handling this. I think we're hopeful that this will be contained. So I only say there's lots of issues. Now, as it relates to the environmental issues, and the president's been very clear, you know, the president very much supports clean air and clean water. And we've done a great job in the U.S. through technology on these issues around energy and what we're doing with our carbon footprint. I think these are issues that do impact other countries. I've commented, obviously, in the case of China and India, very important environmental Also issues, as I said in the beginning, there's a lot of people who don't have electricity. I hope we can advance that. But I think we can balance a lot of these issues.
Yeah. Gentleman here on the end.
Hey, so Andrew Payne, Research Fellow at Oxford and also Council Member here at Chatham House. Thanks for your discussion here today. I'd like to return to Iran very quickly because I think that the previous question, with respect, was a little bit too nice. So you mentioned that
I liked it a lot, so now
I bet you did.
Now I'm getting nervous about your question with that intro.
So you stated that the goals in the Middle East were stability and the prevention of Iran getting nuclear weapons. So far, the US strategy of whether it's sanctions, airstrikes, or on-again, off-again withdrawals has seen precisely the opposite effect. Increased Iranian influence, pressure for the US to withdraw from Iraq, Iran resuming uranium enrichment and handing influence to Russia and Syria. So I would suggest that there's zero evidence that maximum pressure is working. Secretary Pompeo yesterday seemed to basically give an answer about blind faith that it's going to be working. So I'm interested in your view on what credible evidence is there behind this strategy working at, and what specific indicators of success are you looking at?
Well, let me say, and you won't be surprised for me to comment, but I disagree with you completely, okay? And I did like the other question better. But, you know, these are complicated issues. So let me be clear, you know, they're complicated issues. Syria is a complicated issue. Iraq is complicated. Lebanon is complicated. A lot of these issues existed before the president came into office. A lot of these issues still exist. So, and there are different issues in all of these areas. I would say, I think there's much more commonality now more than ever in the Middle East on the view from lots of countries, from Israel to Saudi to UAE to Qatar to others, on the issue of Iran, okay? And I think that regional stability is very important to all the countries there and everyone around the world. And there's no question that Iran has been the major exporter of terrorist activities. And there's no question in our mind that if Iran had more money, they would be spreading more activity. So again, at the end of the day, this isn't a function, you know, this is a function of we want to get to a result. And we have complete agreement with all of our allies on this. We want to get to a result where Iran commits it will never have nuclear weapons. It is not a threat to the region in terms of ballistic missiles and terrorism. And I think there's a great outcome for the Iranian people. So, you know, we'll see.
And one final question, the lady with the pink scarf.
Hello, Véronique Dupont with AFP News. Regarding the UK-US trade negotiations, the UK government is said to be close to giving its agreement to Huawei, at least partly. Would that be a major upset? And what about if the UK also enforces the said digital tax?
You know, let me just say we're in active discussions with the UK government and others about Huawei. Again, Huawei it's a complicated issue. What parts of their networks it goes into, I don't want to go through the details, but there are ongoing discussions on that. And as it relates to the DST, and I've publicly said this already, it obviously came up at my breakfast with the Chancellor this morning. We believe that the DST is a discriminatory tax. We don't think it's appropriate. Having said that, we are working at the OECD to see if we can deal with all these international tax issues.
Well, thank you, Secretary Mnuchin. That's all the time we have for discussion and questions. I want to now turn it over to the chairman of Chatham House, Jim O'Neill, for some final words. And I think I'm going to escort you back to the chairs, but thank you very much. Thank you.
Let me say, as our two guests here are leaving, my own thanks to them both for actually, candidly, a very refreshing and constructively challenging view on some of the issues in the world. I also, before I offer some more reflections and a couple of my own observations of what the tone of Mr. Secretary Mnuchin's comments have been for the rest of the world, I want to thank him myself for coming here. It's quite odd given our own past. It's the first time the Secretary and I have seen each other in a long time, and some of you will know we were once fellow partners of a certain establishment, and so it's a great pleasure for me. Let me also congratulate you, Joel, on your own 100-year anniversary, but your leadership role in putting this together and helping us at Chatham House have this event for kick-starting what is a very exciting year for us. So thank you very much for that, and kind of wow for us as a way to start it. I must also thank Leslie Vinjamura, wherever she is here, for her own active role in making sure this happens. So well done to you, Leslie, who runs our Americas program. I had made some notes beforehand, naively and arrogantly thinking that I'd know what you would say and therefore I could sum up from that, but I've had to sort of throw them away and adjust them. I did think I would start by saying there were two burning issues of the moment, and one of them always, or both of them actually seemingly always, that I didn't think you would touch on, one of which was the dollar, but you did, and I'll come back to that in a second. The other, of course, was the ongoing demise of Manchester United and the resurrection of the active dislike of the current ownership, but maybe that's for another occasion. On the dollar, I have to say, I think I heard you say, Mr. Secretary, about referring to your comment of Davos 2 years ago about a stable dollar. And I want to just offer two observations, given again my own long-term past. I do think you have discovered a rather nifty and nimble position when I think of myself all those wasted years trying to figure out what various US Treasury Secretaries, going all the way back to Lloyd Benson, thought about what it meant when they said something about their dollar stance, which was usually one of a strong dollar. And when I Googled this morning, I saw that there was only really two references to your view, your comments on the dollar, and so you, hopefully with me not now adding an additional challenge, you've seemingly taken the heat out of the persistent attention on the Treasury Secretary of that. But the second one, I suspect, by saying stable, that might mean for the rest of the world, don't assume that the dollar's always going to be going up, but that's my own subjective interpretation. Moving on and putting my own context of it too, I think as I certainly, not that I was at Davos, but I interpret it this way, I think on the state of the world, there was a view that the world economy had stabilized. Certainly from all the indicators I've spent so much of my life following, and sad as I am as a human being, still do, it looks pretty clear to me that in November and December the world did stabilize, with most of the places that have been showing the greatest weakness, China included, showing evidence of some modest bottoming out. However, the third thing to say in that regard, and not for the first time, I must add, with Davos, within a short space of time, events, my friend, take over. And with the very troubling coronavirus outbreak in China, it seems to me, even for the dominant theme of climate change, that is not the thing that's going to focus the mind of policymakers, particularly obviously as it relates to health, but I would suggest crucially, because of the consequences of movement and travel, also for this fragile stability that may appear in the Chinese economy, and a number of others that are so crucially tied into the Chinese influence on the world economy these days. And I suspect this is hopefully going to be a major focus of attention of Chinese policymakers and a number of others that may be in a position to help them. The fourth, I've got only 2 more comments you'll be pleased to know, then we shall break for reception. The fourth thing I would say, and linked to my opening comments, I think you do present, Mr. Secretary, a refreshing challenge to what I would call is the status quo thinking of much of the past 25, 30 years, of much of international consensus. And now if I also put on my so-called Northern Powerhouse hat, I was particularly pleased to hear you say of the importance of the context of many of our international bodies and thinking more about the consequences of some of the things that happen in international agreements for people in their own economies. And I hope you pass that over to your counterpart at breakfast this morning, because as a number of people here know, this government seems to be at least giving the message that it wants to take the Northern Powerhouse more seriously, and it is really important that they do. But linking it to what you've said, I think the thing that I have learnt over the past, now getting on for 4 years, since we had our own peculiar set of self-presented challenges with the Brexit vote, it is perhaps the case that far too many countries have often pursued trade as an end goal in itself, and not in the context of the overall domestic economic and social economic policies. And whilst that means there are huge challenges to the status quo of the likes of the WTO, and touching on what you said about taxation, perhaps also to the likes of the OECD, it is incumbent on the people that are charged with running those organisations, in order for them to be more effective. I think it seems that they have to understand more some of these domestic issues that have come to the table so much in so many places. For individual parts of the world, China, the EU and ourselves, before I turn lastly to the EU, it also obviously represents a challenge to those thinkers. And here, let me say, it's an exciting challenge to all of us at Chatham House and various people in our different research teams to think of a more productive way of how these countries can rise to this new set of how to think about engaging with this approach from the US, which I find my own mind thinking more and more may give the impetus to greater structural changes in their own economies, which in itself, if were to happen, will have a macroeconomic influence, presumably, of giving more of their own stimulus to the world. And I strongly share what Mr. Secretary suggested about Europe itself finally discovering some kind of other forms of domestic economic growth rather than just relying on monetary policy. In my view, a highly welcome comment, and it is about time something happened. Let me finish specifically with respect to the UK, and I thank Joel there for asking all the burning issues that indeed relate to the many of the challenges of the UK-US bilateral trading discussions, and also to you, Mr. Secretary, for the candidness in which you replied to them. As also shown by our own very latest evidence, just yesterday, our own purchasing managers' indices, or the so-called flash one in the UK, showed a notable bounce in December, which for January, which is clearly a response to the strength of the election victory, and maybe some aspects of at least the formality of now leaving the EU is with us. And that's a sign of some kind of perhaps stabilisation coming from elsewhere in the world too. In parallel with that, somebody sent me yesterday, in fact, David Jampola, my friend here, sent me a copy of the latest Edelman survey of domestic opinions, both socially and economically. And the not so good side is that there's a lot of pessimism out there in the country, but flipping it to the other side, there has been a notable improvement in a number of areas, both with individual perceptions about their own sense of where the future is going. And it's very important, in my opinion, that the government certainly carries the focus on that in what guides it into its own self-interest in its trade negotiations with either the US or, for that matter, anybody else. And so thank you again for everybody's role in this. It's been an absolute pleasure to come into the centre of town on a rare Saturday visit. And I'd now like to ask you all to share again your sense of appreciation for our guests, and then stay here. I'm just being reminded while the few of us go up to the reception, and if you can get anywhere near Mr. Secretary through his colleagues, please try and feel free. Thank you very much.